As a matter of fact, just a couple of years ago, a little further away from Malta in the Sicily Channel was discovered a giant, absolutely nobody's disputing, man-made megalith lying on the bottom of the ocean. And that bit of ocean was covered by the rising sea levels more than 9,000 years ago, which makes it already 3,000 to 4,000 years older than the established date for the monumental temples on the island of Malta itself.
Some experts, like Jack Carey, have done some alternative research that might coincide with the science behind the Younger Dryas.
As far as the sunken pyramids go in the oceans of the world, a lot of that can be tied to research being done by Dr. Courtney Brown and his group of very skilled remote viewers. And they're beginning to not only target what they described as being Atlantis, but through their remote viewings, they're beginning to ascertain that it was this very science that caused the downfall of the society, that they used it in such a way that it literally caused a destruction of the landmass, and that may have actually been part of some sort of conflict or war that was going on. The fact that there's just so many of them all around the world is what's fascinating. Humanity has not come together in any way, shape, or form the way we would want or hope or expect or love for it to do ever since the Tower of Babel, ever since we were spread all over the earth.
A conflict? What kind of conflict could Dr. Courtney Brown and his researchers be picking up on? Ancient texts from the Greek philosopher Plato explain in great detail the destruction of Atlantis by Zeus as payback for human arrogance. The legend describes the founder of the great city to be half god and half human, and ruled by Poseidon. As punishment for their immoral bankruptcy, Zeus sent a ball of fire to destroy the aquatic cities. The curator of the Joseph Campbell collection draws some parallels from Plato's story and a similar tale between two warring Sumerian gods.
It is very possible that the Greek story, the one we find in Plato about a lost continent, Atlantis, ruled over by Poseidon, the god of the oceans, that this has earlier roots. After all, storytellers in those times borrowed from other stories, and we can follow, it's called syncretic, the way information, images, and narratives move from one culture to another, particularly if they're relatively geographically close by, which in this case is true. Sure, Enki, the great god of the Sumerian traditions, could have been the Poseidon figure, and the destroyer god could have come from the Sumerian tradition. This is not only possible, it is likely. Zeus is the name we are familiar with from the Greek tradition that comes and punishes the people of Atlantis who have achieved so much because they started taking it for granted.
What could the people of Atlantis have taken for granted? How could they have become immorally bankrupt? Could this be another interpretation of a god figure striking down upon humans for knowing too much?
What I can tell you is that there is a recollection in Sumerian myth and tradition of a time before the flood, when a high civilization existed and when cities existed, and then the flood came and everything was reset and started again. So what's of interest to me in that is the recollection of the memory of something before the flood, something major, something important before the flood.
Could there be a connection between the Greek version of Atlantis and the Sumerian gods?
M'intéresse vraiment, mes travaux vraiment se focalisent tout particulièrement entre...
I think it is interesting because we thought for a long time that Plato had been taught by Egyptian priests. But thanks to the Edfu text, we wonder if he actually had the copies in hand. We will never know. But there are very similar elements between the Plato version of the Atlantis and the Egyptian Edfu text of Atlantis I translated. And we can understand, in a few words, that Osiris, who is considered to be the Sumerian god Enki, fled Mesopotamia to help start a new civilization. according to the doctrine of Enlil, and he flees to Atlantis and settles down on some islands in the Atlantic Ocean. This ancient territory is mentioned in some funerary texts, such as the Egyptian Book of the Dead. They call it La Mata, which can be roughly translated by the water crown of Ta. Ta is one of Osiris's names. It is the Egyptian name for Enki. Like all the other gods, he had many different names. We understand that Ta settles on some islands, and we can identify similar data to that of Plato's writings. In the Edfu versions of the Atlantis, there are always attacks from the forces of Set. Set is, of course, Enlil. We understand that he went all the way to Egypt, even all the way to Morocco, Azores, and the Canary Islands. Set doesn't stop attacking Osiris's islands. Another interesting element to this story, there is a technology that Egyptian gods used for protection, the Djed pillars. They place them around the city. Apparently, some are even on the water. The texts call them floaters. They can protect the city, and we can understand in parts of the text that thanks to the energy coming from these Djed pillars, Egyptians can control water and create water walls, very thick ones, in order to protect the city. Many mythologies and legends have similarities. We understand that Osiris could actually be Poseidon or Neptune, and Enlil, in some ways, could be Zeus.
What is interesting to note is Poseidon is always pictured with a pitchfork that was later connected with the biblical pitchfork of Satan by the Catholic Church. If Enki is connected to this interpretation, could the destruction of Atlantis be the story of Yahweh's wrath on advanced humanity? Anton Parks suggests there is a connection between the scientific version of the cataclysm and the Egyptian texts.
Assez régulièrement parce que en fait, l'Atlantis.
The Egyptian Atlantis must have lasted long enough in history that it is part of Egyptian culture. Funerary texts mention it quite often. Indeed, the Egyptian Atlantis, La Meta, corresponds to the west. It also means the west in Egyptian. And west is also where you bury the dead. We see that the idea remains that when you go towards the west, there were many deaths. In Egyptian history, Osiris's death happens at the same time as another very singular element, which takes place in the sky. It is the fall of the Eye of Sound found in the Edfu text. This is the destruction of a planet which was in between Mars and Jupiter. This is where we find the asteroid belt, and I believe that a planet used to be there. The death of Osiris is at this point in the story.
In 1950, Emanuel Velikovsky published a book called Worlds in Collision. In this book, he discusses that Venus was ejected from Jupiter as a comet and this passed near Earth, causing catastrophes mentioned in mythologies around the world. Could Anton's translations of the Sumerian text explain this very moment in human history and how it relates to the flood?
Selon moi, il s'agirait de...
In the Edfu text that I translated, they mention the fall of the Eye of Sound. Let me explain. In my opinion, Venus was located close to Mulgay. It was one of its satellites, and when Mulgay exploded, its satellite, Venus, is ejected into the solar system, and at some point, it comes very close to Earth. Then there is Osiris's death. According to the text, this was the work of Enlil, who prepared his attack, both on Earth and in the sky. He really wanted to make history and impact significantly the gods' history. He was not going to be defeated by earthly technology. Venus was ejected into the solar system, turned inside it for thousands of years, before eventually placing itself where it is today. Enlil must have really wanted to finally put an end to the lengthy war he was waging against Enki Osiris. and he came close with the death of Osiris.
Que lorsqu'Isis décide de faire revenir Osiris dans un nouveau corps qui sera le corps d'Horus, dans la Grande Pyramide.
But then a second event, the story tells us, and luckily for history in general, Osiris comes back as Horus and the battle can start again. There are many elements that explain these events and that describe how Horus arrives to destroy the evil of the world in order to avenge his father's death. This explains a similar catastrophic event that happened at the same time, such as the destruction of Atlantis. This arrival is most likely a comet, who is actually Horus according to Sumerian text. And this is also when the so-called flood happened, about 10,000 years ago.
Could these ancient Sumerian texts be explaining a battle for the power over Earth? And the destruction not only on the planet, but in the sky? Ancient texts suggest that whoever survived this cataclysm survived to tell the story in Egypt.
Plato tells us where the story came from. It came from an ancestor in his family line, Solon, a famous Greek lawmaker, who visited Egypt around 600 BC. And in that visit, he encountered Egyptian priests who told him the story that there had been a high civilization in remote antiquity that had been destroyed in a cataclysm and submerged beneath the sea, that there were survivors. Some of those survivors came to Egypt and founded what would become the great civilization of Egypt in due course.
And with the great civilizations of Egypt came the Great Pyramid. Could this ancient knowledge that was now buried beneath the ocean floor have made a resurgence on the Earth's surface?
Well, the Great Pyramid, is a monument, but it's a geometrical monument, but in fact it's not a four-sided pyramid. It has a very slight concavity on each side, making it an eight-sided pyramid. Now, the minute you do this, you not only complicate the design tremendously, but it produces rather bizarre geometry. So, this geometry, when we analyze it, produces numbers. Numbers keep popping out.